Sago, it is March 23rd, 2018, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people with look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and a look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation and simulcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tandanega. We are streaming live on Facebook Live, and of course, you can find us streaming live when we're live at www.ltnradionet.com. By the way, you can go to www.ltnradionet.com anytime. And we have previous shows that are playing in a loop there. Like I said, except for when we're live. Then when we're on Monday nights, on Friday nights, you can you can catch our show live there. I am John Kane. I'm the show's host and producer. And hey, I want to give a shout out to my studio engineer, Kelly McMillan, who helped us with our setup here. And I want to acknowledge our opening song, Rumble, by Link Ray, a song that it's gaining new popularity because of the film Rumble, The Indians Who Rock the World. But it is the first and only time an instrumental was banned from the radio because they thought the sound was too aggressive and that it was going to promote insurrection or juvenile delinquency or whatever else. And you know what? At this point, I'm ready to promote both. So that's why I opened up the show with it. Look, my last show, I was pretty animated last show. I was pretty pissed off last show. Now I'm settled down a little bit, but I still need to talk about some of the issues that we talked about on the last show. And here's why. You know, I look back at in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And then I look at where we're at now. There was a time, man, when trouble brewed, our people stepped up. You know, look, I know everybody can say, oh, yeah, but let's not forget Standing Rock. You know, look, when I talk about stepping up, I'm not talking about prayer circles. You know, I'm not talking about, putting yourself in a situation where the best thing you can do is get videos plastered all over social media of being beaten by cops. You know, look, those images are important, but placing ourselves in those situations without us asserting something other than presence. I mean, asserting presence is fine, but until we take the actions necessary to stop the aggression, stop the imposition and the violations of our sovereignty, we get put in a tough spot. But one of the things that's changed since the 70s and the 90s is the strategy that the state and the federal government employ. It used to be they would try to do these broad-based, attacks, really. Whether they would, in a broad-based way, say, we're going to shut down your industry, or we're going to, stop you from doing something. Our battles over tobacco and fuel, especially in the 90s, there was like this carte blanche approach that the federal government, or the state government, I should say, took. And of course, we deal with the federal government the same way. But more recently, they don't do this, this broad-based attack on any territories. Because you know why? That didn't work out very well for them. And part of the reason it didn't work out for them very well is our people became unified. And they stood in solidarity with each other. They spilled out on the Thruway. They spilled out on the 81. They spilled out wherever they had to not just demonstrate and not just be seen, but to shut down traffic, to do something, to take a stand. And even though that was somewhat reactive rather than proactive, we would respond. See, now things are a little different. Now they try to pick us off one at a time. Now let me go back a few years. A few years ago, ATF came onto the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and took, with masks on, with armed, masked men, went down to Wolf's Run, put guns to the heads of Will Perry and his son Brad Perry, literally, came out of the back of a van. I mean, it looked like a terrorist attack. And in case you don't know, Wolf's Run is within line of sight of the Cattaraugus Community Center, where our kids are. I mean, so within the line of sight of our community building, the ATF comes in brandishing all kinds of weapons and literally takes our, two of our men here on Seneca territory to the ground, guns to the head. And what did we do? Almost nothing. A few of us showed up there and raised hell and, gave them some grief and that kind of stuff. I was among them. But you know what? In a situation like that, we should have had 200, 300, 400, 500 people show up there. Look, and I'm not saying to stop them from arresting or doing what they're going to do. But you know what? At least make them work for it. Make them sweat it out a little bit. Let them be nervous. Well, how are we going to get out of here? I mean, it was raining that day. Man, if we'd come in with, 50 or 100 cars into those parking lots, those federal agents would have been sweating their asses off figuring out how the hell they're going to get out of there. But you know what? We didn't do that. We didn't call the media. We didn't do anything. We took it. Oh, we made a little bit of noise about it. I mean, I do a radio show, so it's easy for me to make noise about it. But there was nothing on the mainstream media anyplace. So we just took it. We didn't respond. Why? It was just Wolf's Run. It was just one store they went after. In Tonawanda, when they went after just a couple of stores over tobacco and purses and knockoff purses and a few other things, went in, again with federal agents going after incense. We didn't do anything. Of course, they were in and out of there pretty quickly there. They weren't in and out of there very quickly at Wolf's Run. So they have a different strategy. They don't come after our whole territory. They don't come after our entire tobacco industry, or economy. But you know what? They peck away, and then they make a charge stick. They make it almost impossible to fight them. So what do? You plead out somehow. What I talked about last week, this fine that has been imposed on ERW wholesale, the foundation that is laid by that, it clearly establishes that the state views the sales that we conduct on our territories as sales within New York State. Now, that's a pretty big problem, folks. So what do we do about it? Do we do nothing? We say, well, that's Eric White's problem. Or do we dish it off to the manufacturers who are shipping product to and from territories? Look, they may have pulled over a truck off our territory, but I read the case. The case isn't just about pulling over a truck on the highway. The case is about New York State saying that the sales of tobacco in New York State require a tax stamp. The product that Eric was shipping to Gunyonge wasn't for sale in New York State. Of course, it didn't have a New York State stamp on it. It was being sold on our territories. If we let this stand, if we're quiet about it, if we just let this go away and hope, well, they got Eric, but maybe they'll leave us alone. They are establishing a pattern. They are establishing, and look, I personally got George Maziarz, a Republican state senator, and Tim Kennedy, a Democratic state senator, to write a letter to New York State, to Tom Maddox, the commissioner for the New York Department of Taxation and Finance, demanding that he put in writing what the state's policy was. And you know what he did? Nothing. He refused. Of course he would refuse if we asked him, but 2 New York State senators asked him. And he still refused. You know why? Because they don't want to acknowledge any distinction to Native people. They don't want to acknowledge that we are in any way distinct from them. So they're just going to cite New York State law. As if We are just New York State residents. And I've heard them say things like, once you step off the territory, you're New York State residents. But let's be clear. The state's position, without any legal basis, without any legal foundation, has been that they have the right, some sort of right, to regulate the sales on our territory. And they don't. They say it, but they really know that they don't. Here's what they do have the right to do. They can regulate the use and consumption of tobacco in New York State and the sales of tobacco in New York State. So if somebody comes onto our territory and then takes that product for use and consumption in New York State, it's not on us to say what New York State can do to the people. But you know what they do? They don't prohibit that. They have a policy, and it's an honor system. They have a policy that if you take tobacco and if you buy tobacco outside of New York State, wherever it is, Canada, Pennsylvania, Vermont, New Jersey, Seneca Nation territory, and then you take that product into New York State, they're saying that you have a tax liability, except if it's 2 cartons or less. So let that settle in. According to New York State, now, not according to our sovereignty or treaty rights or any of that other stuff that people throw out there, which may or may not be true on any case, but according to New York State, everybody in the state, resident, non-resident, where everybody in New York State can bring into the state for use and consumption up to 2 cartons of cigarettes with no tax liability, tax exempt. That's what look it up, CG15. Look up New York State Form CG15. That's their state form for remitting taxes for a product, for tobacco products purchased outside of New York State's jurisdiction for use and consumption inside New York. New York. That's what the form is, and it clearly states 2 cartons or less are exempt. So for New York State to say that they can regulate the sales on a territory, they know they can't. They can't regulate the sales of tobacco in Pennsylvania, Vermont, Canada, or anyplace else. But what they can regulate is the use and consumption in New York State. And we've never suggested that we can tell a New York State resident, oh, you don't have to pay any taxes if you buy your product here. What we've always said is we're not New York State's tax collectors. They have no authority to regulate what we do on our territories. So that's what just has to be stated out front. But see, New York State says otherwise. And then what they do is they cite the Attia case. And I've talked about this before, and I know it might sound like I'm kind of plowing the same old dirt over and over again. But I think it's important that people understand. The Attia case, which, and I've heard lawyers, I've heard state representatives, I've heard the governor, I've heard people from the Convenience Store Association all say, well, the Attia case was a landmark decision that allowed New York State to tax the sales of tobacco on native territories. No, it doesn't. It doesn't even come close to that. If you read the case, and again, you don't have to be a lawyer to read this stuff. You can find it online. Look up New York State Department of Taxation versus Attia. You can find it right online. It's easy to find. You can read it in a couple of different formats if you want to print it out. And what it says very clearly is that this case, and in case you didn't know, what really occurred there was back when Mario Cuomo was the governor of the state of New York, he tried to shut off tobacco coming to our territories. Back in 1990, we didn't have native brands. We bought Newports and Marlboros and, all kinds of generics and everything. We bought them from New York State wholesalers. We took them onto our territory, set up smoke shops, and then we sold them. And the New York State wholesalers, including Attia, who was one of the first ones to really work with us, was one of the first New York State wholesalers to deliver product to us without a New York State stamp on it. They knew the state didn't have a right to tax or impose a tax on product that was coming to our territories. Now, the other thing that Attia did was they applied for a federal Indian trader's license issued by the Interior Department and received that license. So they had a federal Indian trader's license. They were a New York State wholesaler, but they were also a federal Indian trader. An Indian trader with a federal license to do so. So when Mario Cuomo was trying to create a scenario where they could have every product that a New York State wholesaler sold stamped, regardless of where it went. See, their attitude was, all right, we can play this game. We'll stamp all product, no matter where it goes, on native territory or wherever. And if the product is going to a native territory for use and consumption of native people, we'll refund that tax. Now, that was problematic. I mean, in many ways, and it actually the problems with any kind of system that does that still persist. In fact, it's abused. There are people that use up quota systems and everything else. The whole thing is the debacle. But see, that was the obstacle. But what ATIA did was they said that we have a federal Indian trader's license, so our license to deal with native people is based on not on the fact that we're a New York State wholesaler, but it's based on the fact that we're a federal Indian trader. And so that supersedes state law. And they cited a specific case that gave credence to that argument. Now, on the first round of this fight between ATIA and the New York State Tax Department, ATIA lost. They appealed it, and they won on appeal. That's how the thing went all the way to the Supreme Court. And what we argued at the Supreme Court, again, had nothing to do with whether the state had the right necessarily. What wasn't being argued was anything to do with treaties or native rights per se. It was really just a question, does a federal Indian trader's license supersede state law? And what the federal government or the U.S. prosecutor, U.S. attorney, used to argue against ATIA's argument was the fact that he could cite two cases in particular where federal courts had ruled that the states could impose a minimum burden for tax collection on the sale of tobacco products on the tribes themselves. They cited Moe, which was Moe versus the Confederated Blackfoot Tribes or something along those lines, and a Colville case. These are both cases out west, one Washington. I'm not even sure where what state Moe took place in. But so they looked at those two cases and they said, well, we've got federal courts that have ruled the states could impose a minimum burden on the tribes themselves. So the obvious argument was, if the federal courts have upheld the right of states to impose a minimum burden on the tribes themselves, then how could a non-native wholesaler supersede state law if the tribes themselves didn't do it? So that was the argument. So ATIA loses. But look, there's a lot of language. There was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of legal dicta that was put in place in that ruling. I mean, you just don't go from the lower courts all the way to the Supreme Courts and just have a ruling without an explanation. So one of the things that Justice Stevens, who wrote the opinion on this thing, the affirming opinion on this thing, he did something that is worth noting. He talked about what the state was trying to do by pre-collecting the tax in much the same way the federal government does, frankly, by pre-collecting tax before whatever even comes to our territories. And this is what Justice Stevens wrote. He said, the specific kind of tax obligation that New York's regulations are designed to enforce, which fall on the non-Indian purchaser of goods that are merely retailed on the reservation. Let me explain that. What he's saying is that since we were only reselling a non-native product predominantly to non-native consumers, there was no problem with imposing a tax on that consumer, especially if they had a mechanism that could reimburse any native consumption for that tax. You know what the court said is, clearly what the New York State is trying to do is to let the tax fall on the non-Indian purchaser of goods that are merely retailed on the reservation. But here's what he said. Again, let me read it from the beginning. The specific kind of tax obligation that New York's regulations are designed to enforce, which fall on the non-Indian purchaser of goods that are merely retailed on the reservation, stands on a markedly different footing from a tax imposed directly on Indian traders, on enrolled tribal members or tribal organizations, or on value generated on the reservation by activities involving the tribes. Okay, so let me again explain. The position that the federal government, or that the Supreme Court, Justice Stevens, was taking was that New York's new system that they were trying to put in place would just put the tax burden on the consumer. It wasn't going to be taxing the Indian trader, which isn't true because they have to front that money. They have to front that tax, to sell it. But anyway, that's the position he took. But and meaning a federal Indian trader. But he said that stands on markedly different ground than taxing an Indian trader or an enrolled member specifically, or a tribal organization, or, and this is what the important part is, when they said, or on value generated on the reservation by activities involving the tribes. What he's talking about there is, this stands for the state that tax a product that we're merely buying off the territory, a non-native product, bringing it onto our territory without paying tax on it, and selling it to market our tax advantage. That's what the federal government is saying, is that's different than trying to tax something that we're more involved in, that we manufacture, for instance, or that we develop ourselves or market ourselves or have exclusive rights to, or whatever else, something that we add a value to. So in other words, even in ATIA, when they were ruling against ATIA, they said, but let's be clear, trying to tax Marlboros or Newports going on the territory is different than trying to tax Native people themselves directly, or trying to tax a product or service that they create, perform, or add value to. And of course, that is the whole foundation of developing native brands. So this fight actually took place in the 90s. I mean, or in 1990. The ATIA ruling in the Supreme Court was like 1991. The handwriting was on the wall, and more people started moving, native people started moving towards the direction saying, well, we better have our own brands. Joe Anderson did, GRE did, and several others. And of course, you bring us up to today, we have stores that are filled just with native brands. Every native territory has some level of manufacturing, including Seneca territory, Mohawk territory, territories out west. I mean, all over the place. And either side of the quote unquote imaginary line as well. I mean, that is clear. And you know what? That is what the ATIA ruling and the opinion expressed in ATIA specifically addressed, saying New York State trying to pre-collect tax from New York State wholesalers for product that they are delivering merely for retail on native territories. That New York State wholesalers are delivering is different than taxing a native wholesaler, a native retailer, a native individual, a tribal organization. That's specifically what they said. So what New York State is doing to ERW wholesale stands in stark violation to the very language in the case that they try to cite all the time as this landmark case that allows the state to tax native people. And it doesn't. And, and here's the other thing that's worth mentioning. Stevens didn't pull that out of thin air. That's not just an opinion that he whipped up on his own. That was cited from the Colville case. So even as they used Colville and Moe as the cases that established precedent to impose a minimum burden on tribes to the state, allowing the states to impose a minimum burden on tribes, and again, I use that word tongue in cheek. Even Moe and Colville acknowledged that it would be different if the states were taxing Native people themselves, or a product that Native people added value to, or a service that Native people added value to. So when people try to cite these laws, they're citing them, they're lying. And I said this last week, they're just lying. New York State is lying. And that's why anybody who takes the time, so when George Maziarz and Tim Kennedy put their name on a letter to Thomas Maddox, the commissioner of New York State Department of Taxation and Finance, and say, it's our position that New York State does not have the authority to interfere with Native commerce. They do not have the authority to regulate Native brands. And we want you to put it in writing what the state's policy is on this, which he refused to do. So now, then he turns around and says, Eric White is operating in clear violation of state law. No, there's nothing clear about a state law that you won't even cite, because there is no state law. The state laws that they cited in this case against Eric were only specific to the sale of product in New York State. The whole regulatory system involving New York State stamps and everything else on products that are sold throughout the state. The products that we sell on our territories, the Senecas, the Natives, the King Mountain brand, Herons. I mean, all of these native brands that exist on our territories, they aren't sold in New York State. They are on the shelves of a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, or behind the counter in a Walmart or a Rite Aid. No, they aren't there. That's a whole different line of products produced by non-native producers. What's on our shelves? Predominantly, and I'm not suggesting that there aren't some stores that still, will come into Marlboros or Newports or whatever else. But the products that are on our shelves are native products that are not sold in New York State. It is product that we specifically add value to, either as manufacturers, as distributors, as marketers, as promoters. That's all of that is, when we say value added, it doesn't mean you have to manufacture them. It just means that there has to be an activity on the territory where we add value to a product that we're selling. And that's what Stephen said in Atia. That's what was said in Moe and Colville. And that is what New York State is purposely ignoring by never even acknowledging any distinction to Native people. But, and again, to get back to my original conversation, they aren't going after everybody. They'll pick off a Will Perry for buying a truckload of Marlboros, and then just gauge the reaction. Does anybody come out and raise hell? No. Oh, we'll go after GRE. Does anybody raise hell? Nah, they'll defend it themselves. They'll go after Aaron Pierce, and they'll stop a truck going from Cattaraugus to Allegheny. Was there much hell raised there? No. Go after Eric White, sending a truckload of tobacco products from, native tobacco brands. Not only the native, King Mountain in particular is not just a native brand, but it's a native brand that is produced with native grown tobacco. Not that that's necessary to say value added, but it gives you an example of, of this product, a native product produced with native grown tobacco, shipped by a native wholesaler with a native driver to another native territory. And this is a brand that is exclusively for sale on native territories. But they didn't go after everybody. They'll pick them off one at a time. And every time they do it, they establish another case. They establish another precedent that they think they can admit into court the next time. And what are we doing about it? That's the question. Look, we're at the bottom of the hour. I'm going to take a break here and go back because I got to talk more about this, and I got to talk about where this thing stands in stark violation, not just to Native people, but even international standards. And we'll talk about that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native.
Your children in the classroom English history. What do they teach about the Indians? Took us prisoner in your fight to be free.
I don't know if they're little white lies. They seem like pretty big white lies to me. They're certainly lies, and they're certainly coming from white people. And, you know, the question is, like I said, what are we going to do about it? Look, before I get back into it, let me go ahead and acknowledge my sponsors, which include Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and that includes ERW Wholesale. And I say that not to, as a function of full disclosure. I have no shame, and there's no conflict of interest there. You know, look, I don't even support the act of smoking, but I will always defend our right to be involved in this industry. I also want to acknowledge Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses. I want to acknowledge individuals that still, from time to time, put a check in the mail and help us do what we do here. Ed Schindler, Cynthia Trice, Neville Spring. You know, and I'll do this for quite some time, and I got to acknowledge my my friend Sugar Montour, who right from the beginning was one of the guys who I turned to when I started doing Let's Talk Native almost 8 years ago, and again, without his support and without the support of the people who are currently supporting and the ones who have supported us in the past. Look, I had many of the businesses here on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and some down in Allegheny and other places, Tuscarora and other places that from time to time would make a contribution to the show, especially when I was on commercial radio and was paying for that time. And you know what? And I appreciate all of you who have helped in the past, because without you, we wouldn't be going into our 8th year. I mean, we just simply wouldn't. So I thank all of you for joining in the fight and doing your part. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. And again, I want to thank CKWE, which is, again, a solid native radio station in Tandanega that carries this show. Not only do they simulcast it, but they also rebroadcast some shows. I want to thank Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, Indigenous Resistance Radio, and any of the other networks, some that I may not even be aware of, especially online, that do rebroadcasts of our show. I know there are people out there who who listen to the show and sometimes will capture audio clips, and and I appreciate when I see something posted on any social media that that refers to something that we've discussed here. I appreciate that, and I also appreciate all of you who share the shows, whether it's the Facebook live stream while it's live or even after the fact, whether it's the YouTube videos, whether it's the SoundCloud audio. All of you who are doing that, all of you who are sharing the show, help us get the word out. And, and in a situation like what we're talking about here, this is the place we got to start. We got to start having the conversation. Because, look, if the strategy of the federal government and the state government is to just pick off one at a time, and we all sit back because we think, well, it's not us, and maybe it won't be us, then we're not acknowledging that what happens to one threatens all of us. Having the state violate our sovereignty only against Eric White doesn't mean that the sovereignty was violated any less. And let's be clear what's being done here. What's being done is the state forcing us to, to be under their authority. That's what they're trying to do. And you know what that's called? It's called forced assimilation. And you know what forced assimilation is? It's still genocide. Hey, it may not be killing us, killing our babies, stealing our children. It may not be the ethnic cleansing that has taken place in the past. But forced assimilation is still genocide. I started looking through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Just a brief look at it. And what I've determined is that just getting up into the 20s, there's 46 articles in this thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Those 9 articles, first 9, New York State is violating all 9 of them. And you can read through it. I mean, many of these articles talk about things like our right to establish economies, our right to resist and stand up to forced assimilation. States, here we go. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with indigenous peoples concerned through their own representatives, institutions, in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative and administrative measures that may affect them. Look, the state seizing product on the road and then issuing a $1.3 million fine, yeah, that is implementing, they claim it's legislative, but it's not. It's actually just policy. That's them adopting a policy that affects us that doesn't have our consent. I mean, there's no free prior. We provided no free, prior, and informed consent to say, oh, yeah, go ahead and beat us up, lock us up, steal our product, and fine us $1 million. Of course we didn't do that. That's Article 19. There are articles after articles here that talk about forced assimilation, that it's a violation. Going right from the first one is more about just general human rights. But I'm looking through this thing. Article 2, indigenous peoples and individuals are free and equal to all other peoples and individuals and have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination in their exercise of their rights, and in particular, that based on their indigenous or original identity. Look, what the state is doing is discriminating. Because again, and I could cite that in many different ways, the state fully acknowledges that a New York State resident can go into Pennsylvania and buy 2 cartons of cigarettes and bring it in and not have a problem with that. But at the same time, they are not acknowledging any distinction of Native people. And why? Because they think they are better than us. They think the New York State, the governor of the state of New York, thinks that he is superior to us. And we've heard it in cases. We've heard it in cases throughout the country where a court would suggest that they were a superior sovereign to any sovereignty a Native people could claim. Superiority, superior sovereign, that is discrimination. That is white supremacy. That is racist. And much of this stuff, including any jurisdictional case, has its foundation in the doctrine of discovery. Now, the doctrine of discovery is essentially this ancient church dogma adopted in the 15th century that opened the door to slavery, genocide, theft of land and resources in Africa and in the Western Hemisphere. And it's from the church. They call it a papal bull that established this, and bull is right, but that established these church doctrines. And then what happens? The United States codifies it in law in the 1800s. Now, if you question whether it's codified or not, you only have to go back to 2005 when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the liberal Jewish justice on the Supreme Court, cited the doctrine of Christian discovery, or doctrine of discovery, in the City of Sherrill versus the United Indian Nation. And this is what shows up. Footnote number 1. Under the doctrine of discovery, fee title to lands occupied by Indians when colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign. First, the discovering European nation, and later the original states and the United States. Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote this. Ruth Bader, a Jewish liberal justice on the Supreme Court, cites the doctrine of discovery, which is really the doctrine of Christian discovery, because it was a doctrine established by the Vatican for the Christian nations of Europe to spread Christendom. That's the foundation for Manifest Destiny, for every massacre, including the ones that Columbus started off with when he first landed, that would go all the way to Wounded Knee in 1890. That whole idea that, and of course, this is only talking about the land. It's not talking about the fact that the doctrine of Christian discovery enabled Europeans to treat us as if we were just animals that occupied the land, that we were subhuman, that they would dehumanize us with this thing. And in 2005, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is still citing this thing in 2005. But you know what? What New York State is doing to Eric White is citing the same thing, because the foundation for any of the state and federal jurisdiction over our territories is based on this idea that simply because white people discovered us, that our sovereignty was diminished. I mean, think about what Ruth Bader Ginsburg says here. The fee title to the lands occupied by Indians when colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign, first the discovering nations of Europe and then later the original states in the United States. What do you mean became vested? What does that even mean? Something just became? It just left being vested with Native people and became vested in Europeans and white people? What is that process? You know what the process was? White eyes laying their eyes on us. And the same thing is happening with Tom Maddox and the New York State Department of Taxation Finance, Andrew Cuomo, whether it's him laying his eyes on casino revenue or his tax department laying eyes on finding somebody like Eric White. The doctrine of Christian discovery. And you know, what does the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People say about that? Well, here it is. Plain and simple. Third affirmation, and this comes out of the General Assembly of the United Nations, affirming that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. Again, racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. So any policy, as far as the international community is concerned, any policy that is based on this notion of superiority, the superior sovereign stuff, beyond indigenous rights, and to be clear here, just so you understand, and these are the little handbooks of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Article 46 of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, just in case you're wondering, Article 43 says the rights recognized herein constitute the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of indigenous peoples of the world. So this isn't a high standard. It's the minimum standard. And it's not even the minimum standard for prosperity recognized by the international community. It is the minimum standards for survival and dignity and well-being, not prosperity. Well-being is not prosperity. Well-being just means that you're surviving. It's just another way of saying, okay, you're surviving, and just not barely surviving, but it's not prosperity. There's nothing in here that suggests that the international community went so far as to say that the international community has an obligation to recognize our rights to be prosperous. Most of what's in here are just basic human rights. But one of the things that is said over and over and over again in this Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the requirement, not the suggestion, the requirement that free, prior, and informed consent be gotten by the member states, not the states of the United States, but UN member states, that they can't just impose their will without our consent. So when New York State does this kind of thing, without even acknowledging who we are, it violates half of the articles in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And you know what? It violates federal law, the very federal law that they cite, including Atia, Mo, Colville, Potawatomi, violates all of those court rulings because they won't acknowledge. And here's how they do it. They do it by not acknowledging that there's any distinction to our lands, to our peoples, to our native products, and to our native-to-native trade. Even though these court cases say that you must acknowledge the difference, because taxing non-native products that we simply buy on our territories and resell stands on markedly different footing than taxing us for something that we do specifically. And that's not even, look, that's not even us making our sovereignty claim. That's all white man's laws that they're violating just so they can do this stuff to us. But again, I got to get back. I know the show's only an hour long. I got to get back to what the state of the federal government's strategy is. Because the strategy isn't to take us all on. Look, I mean, yeah, they got a big reaction out of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And they got that big reaction, which was a pipeline that the Obama administration was putting through, and actually putting through with some pretty good complicity from the Standing Rock Sioux. Dave Archambault, the chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux, had pretty good access to the Obama administration. His sister was the senior advisor to the president on Native issues, Jody Gillette. So it didn't happen in a vacuum. But you know what? Everybody got up in arms over it. And this whole idea of adopting, what my Ganaka Maoli friends started doing, which is not calling themselves protesters, but calling themselves protectors. And this was based on their ongoing fight to protect Mauna Kea, their sacred mountain. So we turned this battle over over the Dakota Access Pipeline into this water protector battle. Our fight to protect water. And we see it here in Seneca territory. I saw the president of the Seneca Nation surrounded by a bunch of counselors doing a press conference because the oil and gas industry, the gas industry in particular in Pennsylvania, wants to dump contaminated, radioactive, toxic water into a water treatment facility at the headwaters of the Allegheny River. So they lined up to give a press conference on their opposition to this potential contamination of the Allegheny River. And you know what? I applaud that. But where's the press conference on what they're doing to our sovereignty? Not just what they're doing to our river. By all means, let's do what we can do and let's fight in any way that we can. But because here's the thing, and I said this last week, and I posted it on my Facebook pages. What New York State is doing is they are interfering with our commerce. And you know what? That includes the rivers. I mean, you think about the contamination, the radioactive contamination that's coming into the Cattaraugus Creek from the West Valley nuclear storage facilities. You know what those nuclear storage facilities are? They were commercial enterprises. They were originally set up to reprocess spent fuel rods. And then it turned into this other commercial service, which was to store nuclear waste. Why? To support not just the nuclear power industry, but the nuclear power associated with the military. Most of the radioactive rods that were sent to West Valley weren't from nuclear power plants. They were from the military. How do I know that? Because the folks who came out here told us that. The folks from the DOE told us that. So their war machine, their commerce is allowed to do things like contaminate watersheds that ultimately come affect us. So the result, the adverse effects of their commerce flow right through our territory. The adverse effect of this fracking industry to create a glut of natural gas will get dumped at Coudersport into a water treatment facility that cannot treat contaminated water from hydrofracking for a number of reasons. One is the radioactive contaminants, but two, the industry won't say what's in the water in the first place. So a water treatment facility doesn't even know how to treat that water. So where does it go? When it goes through their biological and their charcoal filters, it just goes into the headwaters of the Allegheny River. So their commerce, their industries, the ill effects of those industries will flow through the Allegheny territory, just like the ill effects of the nuclear industry will flow through the Cattaraugus territory. And that's not the only place. We've got rail with bomb trains on them flowing right across Seneca territory. And of course, there's the Thruway and Interstate 86. There are interstates, 2 interstates that cross Seneca territory. And on those interstates is commerce. It's not just, I mean, these aren't just, aren't just, vehicles traffic, auto vehicle traffic. There are trucks. There are trucks hauling everything, including tobacco products, I might add, going through Seneca territory every single day, every hour of every day. So their commerce flows through Seneca territory completely unfettered, completely unencumbered, while the state picks and chooses when they're going to seize a truckload of tobacco products and then fine somebody. And when the federal government decides they're going to create a sting operation and put guns to the heads of some of our residents here on this territory. But, they'll pick out an individual here. And then they'll even pit them against each other. They'll try to get somebody to roll over on each other. They'll get people to testify, and they'll get people to plead out their charges. They'll get people to pay a lesser fine, but they'll still have it on the books that they were able to enforce New York State or federal regulations on our territories without our consent, without our free, prior, and informed consent, without even a consultation, with no foundation in their law to say when it was that we transferred our sovereignty to them. Look, I know they have laws on the books that say they can do this, that, and the other thing. Hell, they even have a couple of laws on the books like the U.S. 25, which includes 232 and 233, which are about the federal government bestowing upon the state criminal and civil jurisdiction. We weren't even involved in the process. Well, I take it back. We were involved somewhat because we rejected it. Specifically here in Seneca territory, the Seneca Nation rejected the state's being granted jurisdiction from the federal government. Well, who the hell are you to grant jurisdiction? You didn't have it. See, the fact of the matter is This land that I'm broadcasting from, Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, is not part of New York State. It's not even part of the United States. And you know what? The United States has admitted it. In spite of the fact that what Ruth Bader Ginsburg cites as the doctrine of Christian discovery, that the lands became vested in the sovereign, first the European nations and then the states and the United States. You know what? That's not only is that not true on any level, but it's a contradiction. For Ruth Bader Ginsburg to say this and completely ignore that the Canandaigua Treaty, again, we didn't write that either. We didn't write this doctrine of Christian discovery, and we sure as hell didn't write the Canandaigua Treaty. But the Canandaigua Treaty says the United States acknowledges that our land is ours, and they will never claim the same, nor will they interfere with the free use and enjoyment of that land. Not only by us, but even by our allies and our friends. I mean, so the land didn't become vested in the European discoverers or the states or the United States. No, it didn't. It's a lie. It's again another one of those big lies that the church has been saying. It's a lie, and yet a Jewish liberal Supreme Court justice will cite that lie in a case against one of the six nations whose land specifically the United States says, we acknowledge is yours and we'll never claim the same. The Oneidas. So these aren't little white lies. These are huge white lies. And they're picking us off one at a time. And we're sitting back letting it happen. Look, it's great that we're prepared to step up and protect a river. But when are we going to protect our right to not just have access to clean water, but to clothe ourselves, to feed ourselves, to make a living? Look, the commerce that we established with the tobacco trade, regardless of where you come out on whether it is politically correct or healthy or anything else, the tobacco industry exists. New York State makes millions off of the tobacco industry. It's a billion-dollar industry in the United States. And we carved out a little piece of it. And you know what? The irony of it all is tobacco was ours. It was our industry. It was our trade and commerce. And we carved out a little bitty piece of it. And New York State and the federal government violate most of the articles in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They can't meet the minimum standard established by the international community for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous people. So what are we going to do about it, folks? What are we going to do about it? We'll talk about it more as we go on. I'm not done with this issue by a long shot. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. I'll see you Monday.